All right. So this is the game of Riazantsev today. Alexander Riazantsev versus Dmitry Kokarev from the Russian National Championships. And it's a Grunfeld like we've been playing today. And this h4 move is something which we mentioned in passing last week. Somebody was asking about e4, g6, h4, or asking when they can start advancing an h-pawn. And I said basically as soon as your opponent plays any g6 opening, h4, h5 becomes a plausible approach. So let's see how it goes. dc4, e4. So black turns this Grunfeld into a kind of like Queen's Gambit accepted. Taking on c4 is definitely in the spirit of the Grunfeld if white doesn't take, because it's basically like saying like, okay, I take, I'm just trying to open up the center. I'm still going to attack your d4 pawn. So now e4 is played. And now you would think that maybe the move bishop g4 is logical, weakening d4 and making h5 harder to play. But instead he castles. Yeah, my first chess instinct would be that somehow this might be the move you'd want to play. And then on bishop c4 castles. Is e5 any kind of a problem? Not really. e5, knight d5 seems okay. Maybe c6 now? You can't play like knight b6 here because of bishop f7, knight g5. Something like this, maybe h5 now with the knight gone. And this is not like so obviously great for black, I guess. White got in e5 and h5 and they both, and it seems okay. We'll talk about transpositions to the Demer. We'll do like a quick segment of that. Yeah, we'll go through like all of them as a segment. Right, so h5 here, I think, basically, I mean, part of what I'm assuming by playing h5 is that if they take, we can go takes, takes, knight g5, and then queen h5, with a playable position for white. You know, f7's super weak, and the black pieces are all passive here. So on h5, I'm expecting black actually wouldn't take with the bishop, right? But okay, good. Thanks for asking me that question, because people were wondering that. Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm so excited about achieving h5 is that I don't think you really want to take with the bishop because of takes, takes, knight g5, and then queen h5. There's also like e6 squares controlled by white. Not that you want to rush it because it opens their bishop, but it's a tactical possibility depending on how black decides to defend f7. You know, and they could play a move like this, planning to answer queen h5 with queen e7. But if they do, they have to reckon on knight e4, knight d6. Even right away, knight e4. So if they want to play e6, queen e7, they might even need to start with knight c3. But then you have bishop f7. And then take. Yeah, and it's just disastrous, right? Yeah. So I don't think that h5, I don't think that h5 should really be taken with the bishop, which means white now has this tension or this move, and everything's fine with the white position. So my first instinct, bishop g4, trying to both fight for the d4 square and make this move irrelevant by taking away h5. Because just by the way, h5, if you can just take it with a piece, is not a great pawn sack here. Okay. So this move is intended to really like refute white's opening. That's why it popped into my mind first, because if I can play a good developing move, come into a weak square that you no longer have h3, set up this pin, put pressure on d4, and stop h5, this is the kind of move that can completely refute white's variation entirely after e4. But it seems that this quick e5 move gives white gives white a game. Maybe the knight should come here to stop h5 in response to this. But now we can play bishop c4. And, you know, white's going to try and swing over and play on the queen side now while these pieces are way off here, saying like, hey, we're on safe squares, right? These are secured squares now. We talked today about useful squares versus secured squares. These are now secured squares, and now I think white wants to transfer the fight over to the queen side. Sorry, bishop e3 and queen b3. Transfer the fight over to the queen side so that these will be secured squares for the pieces, but not useful squares. So, yeah. Yeah, seems playable for white after all. So, black simply castled here, which seems to invite h5 from white. I mean, I'm almost surprised white didn't just go for h5 right away. But instead, he takes on c4, and now black's like fighting back. Okay, so this is like immediately exciting. Black just strikes. The alternative here again would have been bishop g4. And then again on e5, you'll play knight h5. I would think that in this position after bishop c4, black might have felt a little bit like white was threatening e5. I don't know. Or simply just h5. So he felt like he's got to do something here, right? And logically, he wants to strike back at these two squares in the center because black's already castled, white isn't. White's played a loose move with h4 as far as like tempi and development and control of the center. He's played one completely irrelevant move, just in terms of the central struggle. That said, I mean, he did get a bunch of good developing moves out pretty easily. So black needs like a central counter, and he goes for c5. It seems right. I mean, what other center counter does he have here, right? If he plays e5, presumably this doesn't quite work. But it's worth looking at. I mean, this move may look insane to you, but this is what you need to consider. On pawn takes e5, you can trade off queens. King here, knight g4, equal. Yeah, d takes e5 isn't even good for white. So that should tell you that this is plausible right there. Queen d1. If knight d1, knight e4. And if king d1, knight g4. So on e5, we got to try taking with the knight. And now if black could play like, I don't know, knight c6 and rook e8, this might become all very plausible. How would you start it? You can't start with rook e8 because the bishop s7 check takes rook. So you got to start with like knight d7, c5, or knight c6. Yeah, I don't see quite how to make this work for black, but this is interesting. There's potential here. You could look at this. There might be something with one of these moves here. It might be a totally playable move for black. I'm just not going to spend like hours here trying to figure it out. Okay, so we're just going to say he played c5, and white played d5. White's trying to keep the center closed here because he wants to attack on the king side, and also because his king's in the center. So that should be clear enough. So now b5, this is like a typical Benoni type of move. If this pawn were on d6, this would be like basically a Benoni. Instead it's here, pretty similar structure, similar tactic. So you take knight e4, knight e4, queen a5. This is a common tactic from the Benoni. Basically the weakness of e4 lets you play b5, distracting these pieces from the light squares that you're defending. So if knight takes b5, there's knight e4. If bishop takes b5, there's also knight e4. And then when there's a threat on c3, so then you take, check. And you get back your piece here. Okay? There was no way to save the bishop from that queen a5 because the bishop's on this. This is the closest you could come to defending the bishop. And now you get this structure. Now this position I've had like a bunch of times with the pawn on d6 out of the Benoni. And there can be some counterplay against the white king like this. Here that counterplay is going to be a little bit slower with the pawn on e7. And so white just goes to crack black's king. And the black king is definitely going to have to watch out because he's given up his dark squared bishop and white has his. queen c4. All right, attacking c3, but also more importantly, preparing to attack d5. The c pawn, white doesn't really need. In fact, you'd almost want black to take it because it opens more dark square diagonals. But the d5 pawn, if he encircles that with rook d8 or with bishop b7, if he captures your d5 pawn, that will tend to open up light square diagonals, which will tend to give you your counterplay. So queen c4 is aimed, I would think, more at the d5 pawn than at the c3 pawn, honestly. Okay. So he just takes on g6, Riazantsev. Gets f takes g6. If h takes g6, there might just be queen d2 to h6. It could be pretty hard to defend against. I don't know if that's what he had in mind, but let's just see. Something like this. Here, check. Can the queen cover this stuff adequately? I mean, the queen did stop the mate. We get to this position. Well, it becomes an endgame that gets played out. I mean, it's not obvious what would happen now. You can play bishop b2 check. You can play d6, but you know, something like this could happen. And then here, and this bishop's kind of awkward, and then you could try and play out a position like this, which is certainly a big advantage for white. Just one random example, obviously not exhaustive analysis. All right, HG, opening up the rook and not opening the H-file as much, only half opening the H-file. And so far as that, it makes sense. Now rook H4 takes bishop D2, right, comes back at this pawn again. And so bishop h6, trading queens to keep this d5 square. So now white's in a pawn down endgame, but black's development is definitely lagging. Lagging badly enough that white might be able to go after one of these pawns. But he certainly can't really checkmate anymore. So knight g5, knight d7, knight e6. Threatening here. Goes there anyway. Ah, he has at least a draw. He's showing his opponent who's in charge. And then he goes after this pawn instead of this one. That makes sense. I mean, from the starting position of this endgame, right here, where I was saying, like, oh, maybe you could go after this, right? You could play a move like bishop e3, rook c1, or rook c4. You'd probably win back this pawn on c5, but then you'd have a pretty equal position, probably, if black developed their pieces while you did that. On the other hand, if you could win this e-pawn, then your d-pawn that's a passer could be much stronger than theirs in the position that comes out of it. So that's what we see Riazantsev going for here. Shows him who's boss and then comes to e7. So now the question is king f7. This is an important question. Why no king f7 here, right? We have to check that. It looks like in the game, he played rook b7. Oh, that was also not giving up e7. It's attacking this. Okay, so the game's going to be really interesting too, but let's just take a quick glance at this move. So one thing you could do is you could push the king back here, right? And then you could play d6 with this piece undefended. And now black can play like bishop b7 or knight f6, and then you take on e7. His king is kind of trapped in here, so this might be something to play for white, right? Like, you know, some position like this. If you take, the king can't move, and there's rook d8, so maybe you need to put your bishop here to stop rook d8. And then something like this, right? I don't know, there's some pressure. Rook b6 seems to defend this one, but it's something like this is plausibly what white could go for there. Let's have a look at rook b7 for a moment, because this seems like a good move too. Like, where's the knight going to go? Okay. So much for winning the e7 pawn, right? He can just take it. Knight e8. So now, how's white ever going to have a good game now? Now he's down 2 pawns, and even if he captures both of them, it's about equal. Is black really so tied up here that he can't? Oh yeah, rook takes d7. Good call. Thanks, folks. So this is serious pressure for white, because if this move, then rook takes d7 wins. So, so this is probably like a winning variation for white, right? Going back, I mean, black had a ton of other possible moves. I'm not saying that, that was anything like by force. But going back, this does not look like white should be winning this. I mean, he's staying aggressive. And now he's threatening, like, basically to kill black here. Like, I'll just show a threat for a second. And if the king goes in the corner, you have knight f7 mate. And if the king comes out, you can finally use one of these hidden checks. Jeez. So knight g5. He plays knight e5 to cover the checkmate on f7. Takes and resigns. Well, that was crazy that white just won this position here just off of the piece activity, with no pawn structure to speak of. I mean, once this gets played, now there's threats like rook d7, knight here, and this feels risky for black. But okay, he's planning it to cover it like this. Attack that rook, makes sense. Trading it makes sense, sure. Moving, rook e7. Jeez. Black is like actually in danger, because here there's already the threat of check here and mate. That's why black moved the king. Wow, that was weird. That was weird. I really didn't, when I saw this, I really didn't expect white could have any kind of like winning stuff anymore. Other than knowing that the game ended in a win for white. But that is surprising. Okay. Amazing. Takes, knight e8. What if I play some random defense? Knight f6, knight here. Knight e5. Rook e5. Yeah, there's a pretty good comment in the chat that says that, like, as long as white is just attacking black, black's almost like down a piece because of the opposite colored bishop. So there's no knight e5, no knight f6, which means like no untangling these things. That's fine. He gets his piece out. Right, white probably all along wanted to take on d6 with the rook, not the knight. That's like a weird detail about this, is that he's just planning to take with the rook in all cases pretty much, because he just wants to keep all these pieces tied up. And then at some point he'll have these knight f6 check type threats, and he also wants to play rook e7. There's a whole host of evil things, actually. Huh, that's kind of a revelation. I would not have seen like how to win this game in this way. I mean, you guys see from this position going into the endgame, you can see how it's plausible for white to go into this endgame down a pawn, and he's got some compensation, he's got some aggressive chances, he's got 2 weak pawns to go after, but it's weird how brutally he thumped black here. Huh. Rook d1, and now he goes knight g5. All right, so I want to just bring out my bishop instead of my knight. Let's just try something else. I'm just trying out some moves to see if I understand what's going on here. So bishop d1 loses here to checkmate, basically. If king f8, knight h7, and king h8, knight f7. So I have time to get my rook in here. Can't take this. Something like this, covering one checkmate, doesn't actually cover them all. So what do you think? This looks like a win for white after rook f7, right? This is one way to play against black trying to bring out the bishop first, which doesn't allow the same knight e6 type incursion. So we go here and we just try and hit him with g4 and get the rook in here. Black just has nobody playing, man. What about e5? Same variation if they went to f7 instead of d7. So this deals with e5, trying to take advantage of this tactical element to try and untangle this stuff, but we just take it, and then this move wins. So after d6, they can't take it, but could they play knight c6? I mean, maybe, but there's all sorts of stuff that can already happen here, right? Because this is already coming down. There might also be rook takes f5 there. Could be another way to do this. Rook e7 probably hangs in there in that case. So rook d7 right away. Also rook d6 plausible. So now if rook e7, I'll trade this way. Now my e6 pawn isn't hanging, so I chase the bishop from here. And same old, same old. So yeah, this is, and we're threatening this whole checkmate as usual. So, you know, he could try and hunker down with this thing, but I'm going to assume that it's going to lose. Well, I shouldn't assume it's going to lose, but anyway, white can still play this position as well, right? I mean, they could even just play like king f1 here. And material's equal, and the black king is just in like a horror show. Right, I mean, you've got mates where you just trade and play rook here, and then you go rook check, rook h8. There's a million ways to do brutal things to black here. So this looks like a pretty awesome game. Where black gave his dark squared bishop was when he played the move b5 here. It's a tactical move striking in the center before white can play h5 and get his kingside attack going, but it commits you to giving the dark squared bishop to get the material back in this sack line. All right, super sweet. We got time for one more, but let's copy this PGN so we can put that up online somewhere at some point and look over it. All right. Never give your g7 bishop away. Sometimes you have to. That b5 move is an important tactical resource in a lot of like Benoni and Banco and modern type positions. This is like a key move to have available. Things can be bad if you don't do it. And even with the bishop on g7, I'm afraid you can still get checkmated. It's happened. Yeah, I've seen that. Here's like a really cool one, okay? Set position. Take off legal moves. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. You guys ever seen this one? Queen h8, bishop h8, rook h8. That's a sweet checkmate that happens with a bishop on g7. All right. Okay, let's pick another game here. So let's just remember openings. There's Najdorf. Okay, I like the Najdorf. Let's see if there's anything that we're studying today. Here's a Nimzo Indian. I like that. Here's an Italian game draw. An h3 Najdorf draw with g4, like we were talking about, fighting over this knight's safety. And this thing draw. All right, let's check out Inarkiev, I guess. Inarkiev was one of the players who I thought would do like the best in this tournament. He started out with 3 losses, but now he's won 2 games with a draw out of his last 3. So he seems to be coming back. I mean, certainly too late to win the tournament or anything like that, but in plenty of time to at least play some good chess, hopefully. So Najdorf, bishop e3. This is a theoretical main line. Pop quiz, everybody. Why does black play h5? What's the point of the move h5? You guys should all know this if you've been sitting here with me for 3 hours. I know you want to look at some draws. I will pick out a draw to look at another day. Today, we're going to blitz through this game in 15 to 20 minutes, and then I'm going to show you all the transpositions to the Black-Murdemer Gambit. MCJGP, to stop g4. Why is black trying to stop g4? Why is black stopping g4? What is this move about? The answer, as you've hopefully guessed right now, is again, we're fighting over this pair of squares, and he's securing the knight on f6. Exactly, I say, old chap. Securing dem knights. Crawler. Very good. So it can be done on h6. It can be done on h5. This knight is very useful, black has decided, and he secures it. No, he really is trying to secure it, for those who doubt it. All right, so now white just jumps into d5 without full control over it, and the hole gets filled with a pawn. Whoa. And black runs to grab this pawn on d5. That's risky because that opens up all the light square diagonals, and also we haven't castled or finished development. But of course, knight b6 is really aimed towards just grabbing that. Sometimes in response to knight b6, you'll see people playing knight a5 to grab b7. Sometimes c4. Here, he's probably thinking that on c4 he has a good rook c8. And sometimes you answer this by just giving up your dark squared bishop. And then you get this kind of position. Okay, so that's the thing that can happen. But here, white just gives the pawn. Black takes it. And now bishop g5. Okay, so now this bishop can't actually go to g7 anymore because of the weaknesses on the d file. Right? Like white can win d6 at least, if not do something worse to him. So it comes to e7. c4 is played anyway. Knight c7, and you see his bishop is defending queen d6. So if white wants to win back his pawn immediately here, he has to give up the bishop here, then play queen d6, rook d6. And that endgame, I've had this endgame a million times. This endgame is like very fine for black. I would say black's slightly better. Because I like how you can use the presence of this e5 pawn in the center of the board. So I like this position a lot for black. I think these pawns are a strong enough structure to hold up to white's light squared bishop. So I like black. There's some more open dark square diagonals than light square diagonals, I feel like. This bishop would have to get here, but we're going to play f5 probably. Anyway, yeah, you didn't like knight d5. I am with you. All right, so okay, so we're here. White goes knight a5 instead of recapturing the pawn. Definitely the right choice. And now in rook b8, c5. And all this stuff would be super crushing if the bishop were on g7 instead of e7, just so you guys know. Okay, so the idea here is that if he takes on c5, is white planning to trade off or to play like queen c3? Probably something like queen c3, right? Or queen e1, something of that sort. Right, like this. So here, if knight d5, you can play takes, bishop takes, bishop c4, and you simply win a piece. See, I kept my queen eyeing this knight. So you simply just pick up a free piece. If the queen comes to c8, you now play queen e5, queen f5, takes, takes. Still down a pawn. Still down a pawn. But with the bishop pair. And actually a super good position for white because we're looking to play like rook e1 and put pressure on this stuff. Bishop f5. I couldn't play queen e6 instead of queen f5, I don't think, because of queen c7. I'm going quickly, so I haven't really calculated all of this. But now this is hanging. If queen f5 check, bishop d3. If rook c8, we can come back and defend this piece. And white's up a piece. This might be right. The calculation might be accurate. So maybe queen e1 if black took on c5. So c5. Well, black can't let white take on d6, so he plays d5 now. c6. Yeah, this is a little bit unusual to me to see white trying to crack black so hard with this c5, c6. Like, against this structure, one thought that I would have more obviously would be to try and crack it with f4, but I guess f4 is not good in this position because of this. So there may not be a way to arrange this. You could try bishop d3 and rook e1, but I guess it's just not super obvious how white's trying to crack black if he doesn't do this c5 thing. I don't feel like I've seen this that often in these Sicilians. So he doesn't want to take because of knight c6. We cool with that? The knight would attack these. And he doesn't want to let white play knight b7. So he moves this rook, knight b7. I guess he can't stop knight b7. So conceivably, he should play some useful move and let white take on b7 rather than spending a tempo on b6, and white gets to play this anyway. So queen e3. Big threat here and a medium threat here. E5 is the huge threat because it just it opens up the position when black's just not ready for it. If queen f5, bishop d3, I'm sure is good for white. So we don't need to look into that too much. Like a move like e4 is not the kind of thing black wants to play here. I mean, if fe isn't great, you can just play bishop c2 and you'll still have fe later. Okay, so he plays queen e6 to defend this pawn. I mean, he has to defend this pawn, and what other move does he have? Not really any. Castles, queen e5 attacks this and this. So again, and this piece is hanging. So again, he'd be reduced to some version of like queen f5, takes, bishop here, right? And these aren't going to be good either. So queen e3, defends e5, grabs the pawn on this side. There's a threat of knight d6 check and taking here, and there's a threat of queen c7 at the same time. So with a double threat, black defends it. Now suddenly white gives up this piece. I guess he really has to watch out for queen f5 check now that he's out here, right? So the other variation would have been queen f5, bishop d3, queen g5, And now is knight d6 good enough? It is. And white's got 2 rooks against 2 knights. So queen f5 was covered, but now that black has these things defended, queen f5's a threat, so he just trades it off, grabs a pawn, black gets castled. And now white's just going to play around the c6 pawn. Just keep it as strong as possible. And try not to give black counterplay. Black's counterplay would be either something on the b file or something on this diagonal. And white just wants to cover all those things. Bishop's heading here to try and threaten that sort of stuff. See, this diagonal makes it hard for white to play b4, b5, which is a crucial part of making the c6 pawn stronger and queening it. So this totally makes sense that black just rerouted this bishop here. So far he's got d5 control. That could be the other thing for white to attack, would be to, like, if he somehow had put like the bishop on b3, that might have been nice. If black plays d4, it blocks this diagonal, right? So it reduces the counterplay. Okay, he covers b2 checkmate a little bit more. And black's got c6 blockaded and a little pressured on, so black's seemingly okay so far. Oh, and now white arranged bishop c4. That's where I wanted that piece. I'm assuming the tactic is rook d7. And if queen d7, e, c d7 here and here, it's a win. And if the queen moves, we're going to try and take this piece to break the blockade of this pawn. This rook's actually doing a good job of covering the king, and the king can also hide here from first rank checks. This rook's pretty well placed. And if we just play some random move with the queen, then it seems like this knight and pawn are secure enough, and white can keep playing around this to try and win. Nothing's changed too much with the position. So bishop c4. So black fights. What about rook d6? That would have been his way to not decide just yet. Someone suggested a4, a5, a6 as like a way to roll the pawns without moving the b pawn and getting killed on this diagonal. But the a pawn isn't going to break the blockade of the c pawn. So I think it makes sense that instead white's trying to position these pieces actively and put pressure on this d5 pawn and see what happens to black's structure. But after rook d6, it looks like there's still work to be done. Maybe tactically it's knight b7 there. Just at an awkward moment when black doesn't have this. If they take here, you take here, and you win. And the rook has no other square on the d file, so it would have to move off, and maybe now you can do this. I mean, you have to check at the end that none of these things are hanging. But yeah, that looks plausible. Okay, so bishop c4, e4 is played. That makes sense. He's he's kind of losing this fight here on d5. So he at least opens up the bishop and the e file where his rook and queen are, so he can get counter shots at the white king. But Inarkiev has really positioned himself well to be able to defend his king when this counterplay comes. Rook d5. Okay, exchange sack. And if he played here, then knight takes, rook takes. This move might even be a worry. Some counterplay there. Or ef3, gf3, rook here. Queen b3 should cover this. Yeah, I don't think this is a problem for white after queen b3. But maybe the e3 move is what's annoying. Might still be winning for white after they blockade it, which they have to. Might still be winning, but it might just be this is what he found annoying and chose to avoid. I'm not sure. He plays with a rook. And now black doesn't even take with the knight. But if black does take with the knight, then it seems white's in control of everything. You can either play e3, bishop e6, queen e6, rook e2, or you can try and save the rook. But if you save the rook, then white can solidify all these light squares, and now you're without counterplay, and the knight will eventually break the blockade. So he goes ef3, the rook escapes, counter threat here. Something's beeping here. Let's see if it's critical. All right. Some tactics. Queen here threatens the rook, so white has to defend it, and he does it in a way that stops this pawn from queening, I guess, because if white just defended this rook with like bishop b3 or something, then after this, it's very, very hard to deal with this counterplay black has. So queen e4, queen f2, and if takes, I mean, white's just trying to keep that one pawn from queening, and then he's still confident that he can convert the c pawn. So queen e5. Right, attacking the knight. So forces the knight back, fg2, queen g2. So black used all his counterplay, and white was able to defend everything so far. And now white's threatening to play bishop f7, probably. Just nab a pawn and open up black's king. He can't defend f7, obviously. It's attacked twice and it's on a light square, so he just at least keeps his pawn. Pretty sure he didn't play rook d4. I'm pretty sure he played king d4, which is on a DGT board how you resign. Pretty sure he played king d4, and the reason is if his queen moves, there's knight g5 check. So the game ends kind of abruptly from here. It still feels like white has work to do, but maybe he's done all his work. I mean, he's threatening knight f3, forking these pieces. The pieces are a little bit far flung. If queen e8, bishop f7, I'm just trying to wonder like what legal moves would black have that deal with knight f3 and aren't terrible, right? Rook e3, rook d1. Rook d1 again, there's like knight f3 with this attack. Rook e3, maybe. This might be an odd way to get the knight to d6 actually, right? Which might be a decisive way of finishing the game off. So like knight f3, queen can't come to e4 or e8. On e4, there's knight g5, check winning the queen. On e8, there's bishop f7. So let's say the queen comes somewhere like f6 or f4. All right? Let me play knight check, king here, knight check, king here. Now maybe there's rook d6, but there's also just this move, which I was thinking might be the way to finish this off. Well, it's not 100% clear. Here I'm threatening rook a3, queen a1 for black as an idea. And not only that, but on rook c7, there is always queen d6. So maybe this knight maneuver doesn't really do it. So what about the other move I considered, rook d6? That might be cleaner, just trying to take on g6. If knight e6, then you can win like this. Whoops, knight g5. Something like that. There's various options. So, well, that had a very interesting start to it. I mean, this fight was c5 and c6. And then it was basically just fun times for white this whole game. I mean, he did a great job of just converting it in terms of controlling where black's counterplay would come from. And then just calculating a ton of moves. Very nice game. Okay, so